Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I would like to welcome you to the representation of the state of Baden-Württemberg to the European Union. I also welcome you all on behalf of our State Secretary for Political Coordination and European Affairs, Florian Hassler. And also on behalf of the Association United Europe, dear President Oettinger, which is offering tonight's highly interesting debate to you and to all of us. I would like to give a special welcome to Günther Oettinger, President of United Europe and former Vice President of the European Commission, and also, since we are in Baden-Württemberg, former Minister President of the land. I would like to welcome Reinhard Bütikofer, member of the European Parliament, and there he is sitting in the Green Group. I would like to welcome also Klaus Welle, Academic Council Chairman of the Martens Center and former Secretary General of the European Parliament. And I would like to welcome Markus Beyrer, Director General of Business Europe. And last but certainly not least, our host, Cathryn Clüver-Ashbrook, Senior Advisor of the Bertelsmann Foundation's Europe's Future Program and Vice President of United Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, next year, around 350 million citizens, around 27 member states of the European Union, will take to the polls and cast their votes for the 10th European Parliament. The importance of these elections for the future viability of the European Union and its member states, but also, of course, of its citizens, cannot be stressed enough. We do not want to let next year's elections result in a fragmented European Parliament in which the political groups are not able to agree on the election of a Commission President for a long time, and then subsequently also for the appointment of commissioners. The European Union, without institutions capable of acting in a time of multiple crises and major geopolitical challenges, that is an idea that makes me feel uneasy. I am convinced that the world needs Europe and the world needs an efficient European Union. And I can also say with certainty, Baden-Württemberg needs Europe and Baden-Württemberg needs a European Union that is efficient and capable of taking decisions. We in Baden-Württemberg have deeply internalized the phrase Europe is our future. The European Union is crucial to mastering the challenges of the future, be it climate change, regional and global security, digitalization, globalization, migration, and it is also an opportunity to defend our interests altogether on the global scene. We are interested in an efficient and ambitious European Union. In Baden-Württemberg, active participation in European policy making and European policy is a constitutional mandate and imperative for our state government. Based on this, we have actively supported the work of the von der Leyen Commission in the current legislative period along the lines of our state's interests. In our view, the European Union is on the right track with the European Green Deal, the major identity-forming European project of the recent years. It sets the right goals and establishes important framework conditions. This is one of the reasons why we have set ourselves the goal of becoming a model state for the European Green Deal. President von der Leyen said, modernization and decarbonization can go hand in hand. As a successful and heavily industrialized region, we want to prove that this quote is actually true. Innovation, research, and digitalization play a major role in that context. We can and we must combine carbon neutrality with energy security, competitiveness, and economic success. An agenda that will reach well beyond the current legislative term. However, we also need the right framework conditions at the European level in order to continue to be successful. In view of the transformations ahead, we need those conditions, especially in the area of state aid and cohesion policy. It is important that strong and innovative transformative regions also have the possibility to support their industrial ecosystems as well as to attract new businesses and investments in a specific and targeted manner. We must help companies of all sizes with structural and transformative change in order to achieve the objectives set. To do so, we need targeted support, also from the European level, for transformation processes at home in Baden-Württemberg, in order to secure and ensure competitiveness and economic sustainability. At this point, I would like to quote the European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Nicolas Schmit, who visited Baden-Württemberg a few weeks ago. He said, "If strong regions become weaker, Europe as a whole becomes weaker." One point is particularly important to us. We are not asking for a redistribution of funds in our favor. For us, it would be sufficient that we could use the funds we have in a more flexible manner for establishment of sustainable innovation technologies. Over and above that, we are convinced that policymakers need to accompany the fundamental transformations that are currently taking place. That is why we believe that it was a right decision of the Commission President to establish a strategic dialogue on agriculture also on the European level. By the way, just 1 year ago, we set up a strategic dialogue on agriculture back home in Baden-Württemberg. In the area of the automotive industry, with its strong added value and important job density throughout Europe, we would also be very pleased if our strategic dialogue on the automotive industry, which we initiated back in 2017, were to set an example for the European level. Route 35 is already a good start. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we in Baden-Württemberg are ready to contribute to all the challenges that lie ahead of us in the coming months, up to the elections, but obviously also beyond, in the next mandate of the European institutions. Dear guests, thank you for coming. I wish you all a very interesting event tonight, and I'm very happy to introducing to you now Mr. Günther Oettinger, President of United Europe. Welcome once again.
Dear Bode Lehmann, dear panelists, Member of Parliament Reinhard Bütikofer, Markus, Beyrer, Director General of Business Europe, and Klaus Welle, former Secretary General of the European Parliament, now a scientist. Dear Ms. Clüver-Ashbrook, moderating the panel, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. Since Saturday morning, we all are shocked. And let me be quite clear what Hamas is doing. Terrorism, violence, murders is totally impossible. No reason, no argument can back such impossible activities. And hopefully, Hamas and, in addition, Hezbollah, and behind Iran, and maybe Russia, will not be successful. I think we have to think about global security, that nobody can violate general values and a general understanding between neighbors. And I think here Europe has to play a role. And we have to speak about this impossible development 2.5 hours by airplane away from Zaventem. And no doubt, what is happening is a part of a battle between systems. Democracy against dictators and autocracy. And if we want to stabilize democracy, and we have elections in June next year, and we want to convince countries checking democracy and/or dictatorship, autocracy, we have to be convincing. We have to be successful. We have to stabilize our own democracy and our own democratic governance in member states and regions, but on a European level as well. That's the reason why United Europe, a private organization, has been organizing this event, and thanks to all of you joining our event, being here in the representation of Baden-Württemberg. The European Union, prior to the 2024 election, an Agenda 2030 for Europe. This is the challenge for our panelists. and their competence and experience, I think, is a guarantee that it will be an interesting panel. Seeing through next year, which priorities and challenges do I see? First one, security. Security for all citizens, for all regions, for all of us. External security, internal security, cyber security. And next year we have not just one important election, our European election. Indeed, we have two of them. We have the US. We have the US election in November. And Trump has not lost for the moment. And Joe Biden is not the winner for the moment. It's an open race. Are we, are you, am I, is Europe prepared if there is Trump 2.0, question mark? No, we are not prepared at all. Not at all. Not our armies, not our industrial competitiveness, not our sovereignty, not our governments. We are not prepared. We have to do better, much better. 2 elections next year, and in November next year, we know what is the environment for the rest of the decade. We have to stabilize our democracy because we have too many anti-European candidates and political groups, too many nationalists in Europe, all over our member states, more or less. And elections in these days are demonstrating 15, 20, 25% of them coming into national or regional parliaments and coming, I fear, to Strasbourg as well. It's about good and convincing governance. First priority, as I mentioned, security. Second, to avoid uncontrolled migration. Yes, migration is a part of our future, but uncontrolled migration and violating rules we have all over Europe is not acceptable. Hopefully, the Council and the Parliament will come to a decision, a quite pragmatic, a quite convincing, a quite successful condition before Easter next year. Because if there is uncontrolled and increasing migration, the populists from the right wing will be the winner in June next year. And my third point is industrial competitiveness. Mr. Lehmann and we are coming from Baden-Württemberg. We have been poor in the 19th century. And we have been wealthy since 1950. And the automotive sector plays an important role, or in general, our industries from the chemical sector, from the manufacturing sector, from the pharmaceutical sector, and services in addition as well. But we are losing competitiveness. We are partially deindustrializing our labor markets, our regions. Just 2 examples. The automotive sector, all over Germany, from Munich to Dingolfing, to Leipzig, to Dresden, to Osnabrück, to Wolfsburg, to Ingolstadt, to Neckarsulm, to Cologne, to Rüsselsheim, to Saarlouis, to Rastatt, to Zuffenhausen, to Sindelfingen. In 2016, in Germany, we have been producing 5.8 million cars, new cars. From A-Class to BMW 7. 5.8 million. Last year, 3.9. 5.8, 3.9, sorry. This is shocking. And what are we doing against? For our OEMs, for our suppliers, for our consumers and users, for our markets. And by the way, BASF, a second example, they are bringing jobs and investments and market shares from Ludwigshafen to the US and to China massively. We are on the way to be deindustrialized. Okay, we can accept it. I would say don't accept it. Stabilize our industries. Stabilize our competitiveness. Or carbon leakage can't be a European example, a European instrument for jobs, for taxation, for competitiveness. Can't be. But carbon leakage is a daily reality. And my last point is extension. There's a window seeing the Western Balkans, maybe not Serbia actually, but Albania, others, discussing Ukraine and Moldova. If these countries will not be on a midterm influenced or dominated by China, Russia, or Saudis, it's our obligation to bring them in our family as a full member, hopefully before end of the decade. I don't often follow Charles Michel. It's not my preferred political option. But what he says here is, okay, to bring them, to give them an option before 2030. But to do so, we have to convince our citizens. We have to influence our citizens, our voters. We have to prepare them, and we don't do this. We have to prepare them that we have more than 30 members, hopefully before the end of this decade. So we have priorities, we have challenges, we have the election, and Democrats and pro-European candidates should have a broad majority afterwards, hopefully. It's not guaranteed, it's the contrary. Let's speak about it from an industrial point of view, Markus Beyrer, from a political point of view, and Bütikofer is green and industrialist, one of few greens near to industries, and Welle is scientist. So good luck.
Well, you can see that we're going to have a very hopeful evening because the challenges are small and the opportunities are great. And of course, I'm being ironic. I'm Cathryn Clüver-Ashbrook. I'm a senior advisor at the Bertelsmann Stiftung based in Berlin, former president and director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, and for many years, almost 12, led two major research projects at the Harvard Kennedy School. But tonight, my function is that of the vice president of the board of United Europe, an organization I'm proud to be a member of, and to follow up on some of the pressing questions you have just heard posed both by Bodo Lehmann and by our president, Günther Oettinger, with this excellent panel that I want to bring up right now. So Klaus, Welle, Reinhard, Bütikofer, Dr. Beyrer, please come up here and join me, and we'll dive right in. So it's true, we have just about 8 months to go ahead of an election which President Oettinger has just mapped as seminal, because this date is being met with a public who does not really understand how these many challenges connect, and who is on edge and anxious as anyone would be who has seen what we have seen again over this past weekend, but who's experienced the consequences in sometimes very personal ways of a major land war in Europe, who has seen the kind of chaos that continues to be sowed with conflicts arising very much in our near region with Nagorno-Karabakh. We've mentioned Serbia a number of times. We're in a time of geopolitical volatility, but certainly also in a time of major geoeconomic challenges, and that these challenges cannot be thought separate from one another is something that our voters are very much picking up on. They're feeling this. And I have some numbers from our work at Bertelsmann to share with you on that specific regard. And we have a very, very short amount of time to, President Oettinger called it educate our voters, but it's a combination of listening to what is going on sectorally, but also individually, and matching that with our competences, our capacities, our abilities to think about governance. That's why I'm so pleased that Klaus Welle is also here, about governance changes that we will need medium and long term within the union to think about how we can make this work. So our voters are on edge despite the many achievements, I think, that we have seen the European Union, frankly, deliver. In fact, much to many of our surprise, that in the middle of what we might seem a series of crises, status of perma-crisis or poly-crisis, but just an onslaught of continuous major questions. I think many of us were surprised at the degree to which the European Union was able to step up, not least, of course, through Next-Gen EU funding, through the emphasis of achieving an easing in the burden of pushing through on the twin transition by offering a range of obviously supportive funds, but frankly, structural tools. And any of us who have been very active in policy making understand that the tools in many ways are much more and can be much more effective. And Bodo Lehmann has left, but one of the tools in which Baden-Württemberg is, of course, thinking of re-putting itself on the sort of economic chain specifically is reinvesting in its digital capacities. They just opened a GovTech campus in Baden-Württemberg 3 days ago, which I think is laudable. And all these components, these tools, how do we achieve a competitiveness package is something that the Commission tried very hard to sew up in these last few months, and we'll see how that has landed with industry, from the Raw Materials Act to the Net Zero Industry Act, and then, of course, the facilities, the resilience facility. I'm one of the people in this room who thinks that sovereignty, in the sense of autarky, is not the way that we should talk about Europe's role going forward in what I still think will be a bipolar security world and potentially a multipolar economic world, but only if we achieve what we might call in a European context an understanding of economic statecraft for the future. But one thing is for sure, our voters don't understand it. 65%, and these are numbers that we ask of our polling, in our polling tool, EU Opinions at the Bertelsmann Foundation. We ask every 3 months, and we just got the numbers back in September, on September 23rd. 65% of our voters are not only anxious, they're highly anxious. And how do we define highly anxious? Those are people who believe that the world is a dangerous place, and there is nothing right now, I think, neither in the news to how people feel it to deny that.
Well, that's realistic, isn't it?
Right, that's what I'm saying. But even more, and this is where it comes the dangerous piece, used to be a better place, because then that is fodder for the demagogues, is fodder for the right wing, is fodder for the populists. So those are very fresh numbers. An additional 27% describe themselves as anxious. Those are the people who have said the world is a dangerous place or used to be a better place. So you see, we all feel, all of us who are voters intending to vote in an election next early summer, that we are nervous. And of course, that's not just key to individuals. We heard the projections, the economic growth projections for Germany from Kristalina Grigorieva just this morning. 1.3% growth. That's what is also projected for a country that is under sanctions siege, namely the Russian Federation. So clearly we need to do better. Not a wonder that the FT titled that European business confidence has hit rock bottom. And so we're gonna explore that. because our voters clearly don't fully realize if they say that their cost of living is their number one concern, how it relates to all the geopolitical, geostrategic, but also geoeconomic dimensions that face us. So I want to lean straight into that with this panel. They've now been introduced a number of times, so I'll save myself that breath. But Reinhard, you are our foreign policy voice on this panel. You've been among the voices most critical of both national and European policy toward China, because as we open the aperture, we'll talk about the BRICS, we'll talk about the competition between the two major powers, but I want to focus on this geopolitical situation in which we find ourselves. We're right just days after an EPC meeting where we had two pieces on the agenda which should be in our capacity and ballpark to influence diplomatically, geostrategically, the Nagorno-Armenia-Azerbaijan piece, and then, of course, everything that's going on, Kosovo, Serbia, and beyond. And we're left with very little progress in both of those fields, and a major land war that's now being used to pony up electoral support for some very contested elections, not least a Polish election coming up this weekend. And we've seen the formation of a government by Mr. Fico just a few hours ago. So if you look at the geopolitical capacities of the European Union, hundreds of days into this land war, where are we? What are your major anxieties? And how do you feel it should be relating to the anxieties of Europe's citizens right now?
Thank you, first of all, for having me. I think I'm rather well known for having few anxieties. And I would straight away contradict you when you describe our voters as dominated by anxieties and not understanding and having to be educated. I think that is one of the recipes for political failure. If elites believe that average citizens have to be educated.
I said they should listen.
I think first we have to listen, and then we find very astonishing realism with our voters. 10 years ago, 2/3 of Europeans had a favorable perception of China. Today, it's the inverse, and that's a signal of realism. Not fully 3 years ago, almost no politician in Germany would have dared arguing that in the hypothetical case of a Russian attack on Ukraine, we might consider providing some 5,000 helmets. Today we're discussing that we will have to step up to the plate and to increase our engagement when, and that's when and not if, when in the context of the American presidential elections, November next year, the United States are probably to different degrees, but certainly going to be drawing down their support. You already see that when you look at the budget.
It could happen much sooner than that.
Yeah. But I just come from a conversation in my group where we discussed security policy and the statement that, yes, we will have to do more for our own security, and that is not any longer an inconvenient truth, but that is a well-received truth. That was without opposition in the Green Group in the European Parliament. That would not have happened 2 years ago either. So I believe we are on a trajectory where we're not as isolated with our understanding, and we're not as sort of remote from what our citizens think, but certainly we should not confuse them. And there I agree with you with failing concepts like strategic autonomy. Everybody, if they look at realities, understands that Europe cannot be fully autonomous with regard to our own security. We can do much more than we do, and we have to do much more, but autonomy is the wrong yardstick. We should invest more into strategic cooperation, strategic solidarity with like-minded partners. Strategic indispensability is also a good term, but autonomy is wrong. And I think we should leave those old-fashioned discussions behind. And when we then look at what the European Union has been doing, and you have put that in a ambivalent light, yes, there have been steps taken, but is it adequate? Taking a step back, I would say, look, the first ever critical China strategy on this European continent was published less than 4 years ago by BDI. 2019, yeah, a little more than 4 years ago, yeah, but less than one legislative period ago. And how far have we come in the meantime? We have created a lot of trade defense instruments. We have invested more into playing offense also by pursuing a more ambitious trade policy. We have invested, for instance, into a very successful, flexible concept of the Trade and Technology Council with the US and also with India. We have featured the Global Gateway Initiative, which is the first time that Europe dared standing up to China and saying, we can do better than you. We can deliver a better partnership with countries that have development needs, that have infrastructure needs than you are doing. And we're now seeing that this takes off. So I think, I don't want to say we've got it. This has been the first European Commission ever that proclaimed through its president that it wanted to be a geopolitical commission, the first ever. But if I look at what has been done and the steps, the practical steps, I would say we are on a positive trajectory, and we should not undermine our ability to grow more ambitious by denigrating what we have been doing and by telling the citizens everything's bad, we will never catch up, the multi-crises are going to devour us, the poor European citizens are between an American rock and a Chinese hard place, and commiserate ourselves.
I mean, I would completely agree that what would be good for Europe is a place of agency, where everything that has, I mean, who would have thought that something termed the European Peace Facility, and I will remind this audience that my good colleague Natalie Tocci asked at the Munich Security Conference 2 years ago, Joseph Borrell, where is this European Peace Facility and how's it going to work? And he said, well, it's not ready yet, and 10 days later it was ready. So all of which is to say, I hear this very clearly, and I see, and I think many of us in this room, particularly those of us that work in this European capital, know that all the tools are there. But this is a perfect segue to Klaus Welle, who is known in this town as the man who thinks the policy, political pieces, and strategy together. The facts don't lie. The survey doesn't lie. So clearly something about the messaging or how we tie these things together to position Europe in this shifting architecture, both geopolitical and geoeconomic, is not yet fully understood. So my question to you, Klaus Welle, the status quo assessment, and we'll move, clearly we're going to move on to the future and what these three gentlemen see as an agenda for 2030. But how are we doing now? Also in structural terms, in terms of tools, policies, and how we bring that together.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree with Reinhard Bütikofer that we've come a long way, but we need to do much more. For example, Günther Oettinger has said we need to deal with security. We don't have a real internal market for defense products. It's hollowed out by national exceptions. And, you know, there are people who are saying that we pay 30% too much. So, yes, we can discuss 2% or whatever, but the first thing should be to stop the waste. I mean, the Leopard 2 is built in manufacture work, if I understand this correctly, like in the 19th century. Can't be the case. We have a multiple number of systems compared to the United States. That means we cannot scale. And in a moment of need, the Polish need to buy tanks from South Korea. By the way, I hope the Polish fit in to the tanks of South Korea, because as you probably South Koreans are a little bit different. So we need to address structural issues.
One of the tall Asian nations.
Good. So what are the structural issues? And maybe this is already a bit leading to what we have to do. We need an internal market for armament products. We need to build up our own production capacity, so that we are becoming less dependent on, you know, whether other ones want to deliver. We have, with the last MFF, a kind of rudimentary budget line for transport and logistics. That has to be increased massively, because, you know, in the most likely case of an aggression against a new state, that's going to be the Baltics. So the key question is, how can we assist? How do we get French material, Spanish material, German material there before it's too late? So I think for the next MFF, transport and logistics should be a top priority. I also think that we need a kind of EU DARPA. The Americans invest into research with double purpose, civilian purpose, but also military purpose. NATO has a budget line of 1 billion, but compared to what the European Union could do, 1 billion is nothing. So we need this. Michel Barnier has been working under the guidance of Jean-Claude Juncker on a civil protection service. So conceptually, it's all there. Where's the civil protection service? I mean, if we think about military, but at least we should be able to help ourselves with a civil protection service. So the basic argument I would like to make is the following. We have seen that in the Ukraine war, NATO and European Union have become complementary, because NATO is great in the hardware stuff, but in times of weaponization of everything, the European Union had to deal with refugees, with energy, with food, with hope, providing a perspective for membership. We have become complementary. NATO alone couldn't do it. And my argument is, going towards the future, the EU member states will not be able to deliver on the expectations in the area of defense if we are not supporting this with real different approaches inside the European Union that's making it affordable. That means internal market, that means production capacity, that means research, that means transport and logistics, and a civil protection service.
So just to frame your expectations for this next hour effectively, is we will do this status quo assessment, we'll plot the agenda for 2030, we'll look at hurdles and opportunities, and then it's over to you. So before you, this is the time to really invest in the kind of points that you want to pick up on with this panel. So we've talked about geopolitics, but of course geopolitics has influenced the way that Europe can do business, how it can do business. I think with an acceleration that is sort of unknown in recent history, beginning, of course, with the financial crisis, but then with the impacts of the pandemic on supply chains, the revelations on key raw materials, the shifting of availability on key raw materials on the one hand, then, of course, the midst of the twin transition, the kind of framing regulations that the EU put forth, I mean, at a pace that I can't remember has been as historic, both on energy, on technologies that are coming, DSA, DMA, AI Act, CHIPS Act, the kind of things that we need to get ahead of. And we can argue about whether or not we've gotten ahead of that or are getting ahead of that. But it frames the conditions in which Europe is doing business in a different way while these tectonic shifts are going on. So from your perch at Business Europe, how is Europe doing? How are we doing on our competitiveness? And how are our voters going to understand how critical economic statecraft is to our security?
Well, first also good evening from my side. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Let me start by picking up two things I heard, and then I'll come back to your question. So first, I agree with Reinhard Bütikofer that we need to be very careful, even so I'll say a couple of critical things after on, to picture too black a picture. Because, I mean, this is what we have in the media every day. It's a debate which I have with my mother, precisely, I mean, as an average voter, 90 years old, but very, let's say, very alert. Say, well, everything is dramatic. Of course, we have a media logic where we are constantly bombarded with negative news, and you cannot even escape it. I mean, when I was younger, you opened the newspaper and you read what you wanted to read. I mean, today you're bombarded with everything the whole day, and of course the logic is if something is happening somewhere, and unfortunately a lot of grave things are happening, but there's also days where, I don't know, there's a bomb in a bus somewhere, very bad, but you would, 30 years ago, you would not have even known. Today you hear it 5 times a day. So we have this logic, and we need to be very careful not to enter in too negative a spin. On this I totally agree. On what Klaus Welle said, because this has economic implications. I mean, number one is, okay, I think I grew up I grew up still with the Iron Curtain. So in 1985, my first university year, I woke up with the noise of tanks. In the street, I lived in Vienna back then. I jumped out of the bed, and my first thought was, shit, the Russians are coming. And my second thought was, how do I join my unit? And when I arrived at the window, I saw that actually it was our tanks, 26th of October, parade, national holiday, went back to bed. But back then, this was the immediate reaction. Then we had overcome this, and I've seen my kids growing up with a feeling that when I talked about these times, I mean, this was like ancient Egyptian history. But, and it was a very nice idea to say we can use the money for much better purposes. And this peace dividend was a wonderful thing. But I think we also need to be realistic, and we now need to see that we need the structures we need going. And I totally agree on the internal defense market, but there's also a couple of other things. I mean, defense and defense industry was something which was not wanted, and banks still tell me they cannot even finance it, because you have all kinds of rules still which basically come to the conclusion that it's not a good thing to finance defense. So there's a couple of things where we need to rethink things, and this will not go via the taxonomy or what have you. There will need to be a clear expression of political will that the world has changed, and unfortunately we need to adapt to it. And I would have preferred that we would not have need to have this discussion, but it's very clear. Where are we? So, I mean, first, and is Europe still a good place to do business? Well, let me start rather on the positive saying, I hope so, yes, because first, I mean, I see that there's very motivated entrepreneurs, and there's excellent collaborators and everything, and I still see a lot of potential to start on the positive. At the same time, I mean, when we started this institutional cycle, we had a program called the 3 Ps, Prosperity, People, Planet. the aim was to make Europe the best place to live, work, and do business in the world. So are we even close to this? Certainly not. And if we look at the state of our competitiveness, it is a big challenge. I mean, I'm around for a while. I've not seen a situation where so many companies are taking decisions not to invest in Europe and to invest elsewhere, in Asia, in Northern America, Mexico, what have you. And there is, let's say there is reasons which are due to things we cannot influence, like change of demography, I mean, shift of political fields of gravity, and there are things where I think we did not really do our homework. So we do a big survey every year, asking our members, where are we? So the one we did this year came to the conclusion that, I mean, where we always ask, one of the questions we always ask is, where are we? Are we a better or worse off business location compared to our major competitors? And this time we had 90% of our members saying we are less well off than 3 years ago. This is the highest percentage we ever had. And this is also reflected in the investment flows. And there's reasons for it. There's push factors and there's pull factors. There are things where, well, I think there are things which have been partly inflicted on us, like, I mean, the cost on energy, which is a direct consequence of the war in Ukraine. Of course, you can always see, I mean, certain things could have been foreseen and everything, but still, there's a certain component of this. But then there are things we can work on. There is regulatory overburden. This comes right after the cost of energy, where our companies tell us they're simply, and this is a bit an answer to what you've said before, there's a lot of good things happening, but there's too much happening and too rapidly. And our companies tell us they're drowning in legislation. And we had, I don't know, we had 5,000 pages of new duties for companies in the last couple of years. I mean, this is simply not really digestible. And then we have, partly as a consequence of this, partly standalone, the problem of too lengthy procedures. I mean, I have companies come to see me and say, I have a project, I cannot say where, but after 7 years, we still are in the last phase of blah, blah decision making. And I have a project elsewhere, I will also not say where, but in countries we know well, and say, okay, after 9, 10, 12 months, they're on stream. So this is the things, this is the realities we are fighting with, and let's say on top of these push factors, we have pull factors, which is aggressive policies of other parts of the world. I mean, there's the US IRA, there is what the Chinese do. A lot of these things I do not agree with. But of course, I mean, all this produces a toxic mix. And of course, the fact that up to a certain extent we have not always done our homework is making us vulnerable. So 2 more thoughts. There are things going in the right direction. I mean, if I look at the State of the Union speech, and there has been the acknowledgement that we need to make doing business in Europe easier, very clearly, that we need to do whatever it takes. I mean, this is a bit the Draghi say, to keep Europe competitive. And there's also a couple of good proposals. So all these things are acknowledged. But now it's about rapid delivery, because it's not 5 to 12, I think it's 5 after 12. And we will need to do certain things dramatically differently. I mean, Clinton said once, it's the economy stupid. I think this is still very valid. Of course, you need to make the link to the voters. The problem we are having a bit in the political things, we all grew up with the idea that, of course, as long as the unemployment figures are not rising dramatically, there's no big problem. The problem we have now with this counter action that we have, the boomers sneaking out of the labor market, means that the moment we will see the negative consequences on the labor market, it will be dramatically too late to reverse course. And one last thing, not wanting to be too long, and if you ask me for one piece of advice, I think we need, and up to a certain extent, pretty much the European Union will need, to stop to try to micromanage companies. Because this is not working. This is stifling innovation and investment. And this will not make us more successful.
Well, that's a fairly critical point, since we are seeing now how much more government involvement, government stewardship, whether it comes from the I mean, you've mapped very well, I think, the push and pull factors. This idea for control, this vertical negotiation with our own businesses, and whether we're doing that well, I think leads us straight to our second realm, which is I've asked all three of you to map out your priority areas, and you'll see that our organizers have mapped not just to the election, but beyond. So not just what's in the campaign package, shall we say, but to something that would tack closer, I mean, perhaps directly linked to goals of the multilateral institutions as well, to 2030. So priorities, based on this very mixed appreciation you've heard, priorities for an Agenda 2030, going into an election and beyond. Reinhard Bütikofer.
As I'm not running again,
I know, you're
have not,
so at liberty.
I have not looked at the package that my party is preparing, so whatever I'm going to say, just count it against myself, not against the Greens.
I think that's well understood.
One of the priorities, no, I believe the priorities should be developed under the assumption that Clinton's sentence, "It's the economy, stupid," is not adequate anymore. It's not the economy, stupid, it's the geopolitics, stupid. Volkswagen would hope, and BASF would hope it's still the economy, but it's not. We are confronted with players, Putin. He's an imperialist. He's not driven by economic rationale. She is not driven by economic rationale. He wants to establish Chinese hegemony first in Asia and then across the globe. And we have to understand that this geopolitical paradigm has to be integrated into all aspects of our policy making, including the economy. Under that assumption, I would say one of the major challenges that we should tackle as a priority over the next 5 years is, and I alluded to that earlier, making a better offer to countries in the global south than the Chinese are making. In practical terms, that means, are we going to deliver the climate finance that we've promised to deliver by 2020? I heard a couple of months ago the German government had announced that they would now, for the first time this year, fulfill the pledge. And last week I heard maybe not. If we do not put real effort behind the Global Gateway Initiative, for instance, we're not going to be able to play ball in the big leagues. That is something that we have not fully understood, I'm afraid. Just giving you an example, we had an AU, African Union, EU summit beginning of last year. After 1 hour, the deputy foreign minister of Belgium was the highest ranking European in the room. That's how we do geopolitics. I believe that this is of fatal relevancy. As a Green, I can say we have always advocated for more equity and social and industrial justice and sustainable development goals for moral reasons. Today, this is a geopolitical necessity. If we do not do that, all of these players that want to have agency, that not content with the role that they're playing at the moment, will be turned into a strategic reservoir for China's and Russia's and other authoritarian regimes' ambitions. So that's a priority number one. Second, we have to put a priority on concluding the task of bringing Europe together and making Europe whole. We've been talking about Europe one whole, free and democratic, but it's not really the case. We have waited much too long with the Western Balkans. We're still hesitant with regard to Ukraine and Moldova, and Georgia is a bit more difficult. I think Charles Michel, and there I want to echo what Günther Oettinger said. I rarely agree with Charles Michel, but there he was right. 2030 should be our target date for concluding the enlargement. And it is also a geopolitical necessity. And the third priority that I would identify, and I think Mr. Beyrer will like that, is creating more competitiveness at home. You cannot just play defense. A team that only plays defense rarely wins a game, only if the others score enough own goals, but you cannot rely on that. So we have to play offense, and that means, for instance, coming back to the single market. And I'm fully with you, Herr Welle, about what you said. We have even a directive passed in 2009 that stipulates that in procurement with regard to defense industry, there should be a minimum of competitive practices. It's never been implemented. So I'm fully with you there. But that's not the only sector where we don't have a single market. And the promise of the single market used to be one of the biggest promises and the most powerful promises. And I really wonder why this is not on the agenda today when we look at what the Americans do. There's one remark that I want to make where I'm critical towards some of the discussions we're having in the Union. For instance, in the Critical Raw Materials Act, all of a sudden there is a goal that 40% of processing should be done in Europe. I can't see a really good argument for that. Instead of playing the nationalist card of reshoring, we should play the cooperative card of friendshoring or ally shoring. For instance, if we want to partner with countries in the global south that are resource rich, why don't we help them build a processing industry that would make us less dependent on China and give them a leg up industrially? So I think that would be the third priority, to transform our own competitiveness, not just by dishing out subsidies, but by changing the rules.
You can tell this is a vivid discussion because I'm already getting points from right and left who want to come in on these different components, and that's why Herr Beyrer gets to go next. But I think the piece that came out very clearly here, Reinhard, is this component of knitting these issues together because we have a credibility crisis. Because if we can't deliver on all these issues, then quote unquote just saying it or referencing values or referencing other principles, we have these critical trade-off issues with which Klaus Welle has so diplomatically framed in the multi-annual financial framework. I mean, those are critical. But if those are not knit together, then you not only have a credibility problem domestically in the union, but you have a global credibility issue. And then that brings questions in it, like what I call, and we've discussed this, multilateral parallelism, where if we don't frame the rules, where we don't set up a credible infrastructure, where we act with impunity or failure, you end up having China as a lead nation in the BRICS and elsewhere be more attractive, expand, move into a de-dollarization space, which we can then no longer control. But over to you.
No, I mean, I hear with displeasure that you are not running again, because I always liked our exchanges, but I see with pleasure that you are in campaign mode. But look, I mean, for me, there's no contradiction. I mean, obviously, it's the economy and the geopolitics. And my take is, I mean, two things. I mean, first, we are working on it to become politically stronger, and I think this is absolutely necessary. I totally agree. We need to make Europe whole. There's also some progress. I mean, I don't agree with everything which has been done in the last year, but if you talk about the famous telephone number of Kissinger, I mean, I think the President of Commission is more of a telephone number than we have seen for a long time. So there is progress in this direction, which is very much acknowledged. At the same time, we also need to see that politically, structurally, militarily, obviously we are much weaker than the US or China, which for me means two things. Obviously, we can only be strong on a global scale if we are economically strong, which burns down to your last point of offense and competitiveness, on which, of course, I fully agree, but I think this is a necessary and logical base, number one, and number two, and on this I also agree, it's about the value propositions, and meaning that we, I mean, I totally agree, we will need to have strong links to like-minded countries, but also to all other possible countries of the global south, and to make a valid value proposition. But I would underline the word value, and I think we will need, I mean, it's very clear that there are certain values, core values, our core values we need to defend. But at the same time, I think we will need up to a certain extent to stop with our over-moralistic approach, which we have applied in certain fields. And which is, and I have this debate in the B20, in the global business coalition, even from not developing, even from developed countries, where people say, what the heck do you want to impose on us? And you know it, I mean, the word regulatory imperialism, I mean, this is, you don't hear it only once now and then. I mean, I hear it more and more often. And again, we will need to be very precise. What is the course of our value we need to defend? And on which might we have become a little bit too, we know the wisdom and we know what you need to do. Because otherwise, I mean, we will also push these countries, which I also see as necessary partners, into the Sino-Russian camp. And I think this is something we have to avoid. One word on the critical raw materials, again, agree. I think it is a good thing if we can do more on our own, but it's very much about being realistic. We know that today it's more or less the ratio is 15% we mine and process on our own, 85% we import. So looking at the raise of the necessity of critical raw materials and minerals, we also know that, I mean, we need to make a hell of an effort to maintain this ratio and not to have it drop. But let's say we are super efficient and come to 20 or 25%, this will still mean that we will import 75 to 80%. So totally agree on what you said. I mean, there's absolutely no alternative. You want me to go to my proposals, or we'll leave it there?
Very quickly, because I've got Klaus Welle just itching to get in there.
No, so
he's taking copious notes.
No, I mean, I do not want because no, I mean, Klaus.
Everybody's got something to say.
I will be super brief. So first, I mean, give regulatory breathing space to companies. I mean, this is what I said before. This is very important. Second, this again, I agree with Reinhard Bütikofer. Deliver on the single market. I mean, we have lost sight of this, and if we are not succeeding there, we will lose it. Third, of course, we need energy. We need energy supply at competitive prices, and on this we will need to discuss the details. We need an energy and climate policy that also works for business. We totally share the goals, but not everything in the implementation has worked. It has a fallout, and we will need to get this right again. Fourth, of course, is about skills and innovation. And fifth, something again we will agree, we need to open up markets. I mean, strategic autonomy is very much about diversification, and is very much about opening up extra resource markets, and also, of course, opening up extra export markets. I'll not go into details. I've been too long already, and I also want to listen to Klaus. Thank you.
Klaus Welle, you're the systems. For a long time, you were the systems operator, figuring out what kind of institution structures you would need to get things done. What these two have mapped out as an agenda is ambitious in and of itself, and I'm sure you have your own, and the Martens Center is working on these ambitions as well. But then it takes actors, people, systems, and structures to do that. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail in our third round, but I'm sure you're going to give us an insight into that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I like the question because I studied institutional economics or new political economy at the time, so that's close to my thinking. But maybe let me start there. I think we have to understand that the security challenges we are having are not time limited, but structural. And they are structural on both sides of Eurasia. I'm saying Eurasia because the Americans are always thinking in terms of Eurasia. We have a fight in Europe, not about Ukraine, but about which rules to be applied on the continent. Russia is trying to impose the rules of empire or the rules of the 19th century again. If they are successful in Ukraine, that means that especially our Central Eastern European members, but not only, will have to live under this threat permanently. So it's not a conflict limited to Ukraine. It's about how should the European continent be organized. The Union of Citizens and States, which is the European Union, which is structuring, in fact, the center and the west, or empire. And on the other side of Eurasia, China, it's even worse, because the logic of that conflict is not the Cold War. The logic of the conflict is very close to the situation before the First World War in Europe. You have an up-and-coming industrial power which has started a major fleet-building program, which we know from the Kaiser. And you have the established power, the United States, which is challenged in its role in that area. And we have to hope that the outcome of this conflict is not the same that has devastated Europe, not only the First World War, but also in the Second. So we are in a times of changing paradigm, from price paradigm, since 1980, 1990, where we thought system conflict is over, to a paradigm of security. The problem with this is we are no longer importing deflation, we are now importing inflation, because we don't want Huawei, we want Nokia Ericsson, less good, more expensive. So for the social cohesion in our society is not very good. Right. At the same time, finally, we have to confront demographic change. My year 1964 was we had the biggest number. And at the same time, we have democracy and we have defense. And we have to do decarbonization. So the question is, how are we going to finance that? And there, I think these two arguments perfectly meet. We can only finance that if we have a functioning economy. And my impression is that the internal market stopped a little bit with industrial goods, which are losing relatively in relevance, and didn't really start on services. Also, the veterans still remember the debate about Bolkestein. But for example, I had a debate with young business people from the digital, and they said we can wonderfully establish a business in Europe, but we can't scale it. You want to scale it, we have to do it in the United States. So why can't you scale it? Because we don't have a capital market union to finance and a company. Because we don't have a banking system which is transnational. Some years ago I had a debate with the director of a German bank, with the head of a German bank, and he said we would never buy an Italian bank because you buy an Italian bank and you have to make use of the securities you can't do because it takes many years. So we cannot accompany growth strategies neither by functioning capital market nor by really a European-wide banking system. And there we are in the area of services. So in fact, we have to think services and industry together. And therefore, I think these match very well. I would like just to add two more things. Maybe to do a little bit of promotion. I've chaired a process in the Martens Center to think about the future, and we call it the 7 Ds for sustainability. So my argument is that sustainability has to become the lead consideration across policy areas, not just in the environmental area, but also we need sustainable debt, we need sustainable defense, we need sustainable policy for democracy. Also, decarbonization has to be done in a sustainable way, because otherwise the political system will change so quickly that you can't implement, and the same for de-risking. So in other words, the future has to be the focal point of all our policies across the board, and these are 175 proposals on how to do this in the next legislature. Maybe a final word, because you said institutions. One thing is also clear: if our heads of state and government want to continue to sit on their own on the long tables of Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi Jinping, we will not play a role. So the question is, who could do that? Personally, I have serious doubts that our foreign ministers would be strong enough. But given that anyhow, the European Council is developing into a kind of collective presidency, maybe that's a role for them.
So I was hoping my last sort of round would look at the strategic impediments and the opportunities, but you already heard some of that in what all three gentlemen have said. The word that strikes me here most is the point strategic, because what we're wonderful at in the European Union and my native Germany is the diagnostics. And what we're really bad at is forming the diagnostics into a strategy in the way that all three of you graciously have, which is to say that that requires priorities, it requires difficult trade-offs, it requires a communication on those trade-offs, and it requires the kind of systemic change that will be painful, because as we all know, that kind of change creates loss. It really forces us to change the way that we do business and the way that we knit these issues together. And that alone, I think, is going to create quite some transformative energy, good and bad, or at least it might feel bad for some people in that transition period. So because we only have a few minutes left, I will fold those issues, or some of those issues, into your questions, because I want to get your voices into this conversation. So go ahead, raise your hand, introduce yourself briefly. As we used to say at Harvard, whatever you say has to end with your voice going up and a question mark being posed at the end. So that is the one requirement of your interventions this evening. Well, for saying this was a spirited debate, you should be in on this. Okay, good. Front row, and then we'll meander back. And the second person I'm going to pick on is a woman, so I clearly need a female hand to go up in the interim. Go ahead. The microphone coming to you.
Right, Alan Riley, Atlantic Council. My concern is which actually is reflected, I think, in a comment about the processing target, is that there is with so much European policy, we're very good at the detail, and we can have a fantastic way of looking at it and developing it under European law and the structures and so forth. But we don't think strategically sufficiently, both internally, but most crucially, externally. And so therefore, what seems to be happening often is that we cannot get out of our EU silo and think much more broadly and geostrategically. And I think that is actually part of the more deeper problem of dealing with the challenges. I mean, essentially, the Union was born in a very protected environment at the beginning of the Cold War, surrounded by NATO and the American protection and so forth. And we've never had to think like this. And I think this actually is this, if you like, what's the Greek phrase, the metanoia, a change of kind of framework and a fundamental framework. Is that actually what we're looking at? And I think the question is how do you actually achieve that metanoia? Because it's not just, the panel gets it, but the issue is, and I find it so often, particularly when I'm dealing with a lot of the energy issues I deal with, is the ability to see outside and see the much broader approach you need to deal with these things and the potential incoming threats. So that's what just my sense.
No, I think that's a very fitting question, and I'm reminded of this because, of course, the Barroso Globalization Fund that was supposed to insulate Europe from globalization is the same wrong-headed thinking when we think that strategic autonomy will lead to autarky. So it's the same idea. Reinhard, you wanted to jump in on that. Again, females in this room, of which there are many, by the way. Next question goes to you.
Thank you for your question. I think I have a good answer, but I'm not sure the Atlantic Council will like it. Thinking out of the box, not being restricted to the silo. For instance, and I just try to make a broader argument by pointing to a specific example, would have meant to avoid that the UK and the EU and Japan and Taiwan and Korea and the Australians all go to Washington individually complaining about IRA and hoping to get some small deal by the grace of the Congress. Rather, we should have done what obviously the South Koreans proposed to the EU, and the EU was not smart enough to pick it up. We should have aligned all those middle powers, telling Washington, look, you may not have understood where we are. We know that we have, for the last 70 years, needed your help to stand tall, whereas you have almost until yesterday been able to always do what you wanted, even if major countries like Germany and France would not consent. Think of Iraq. But that is not anymore the case. If the Americans want to be successful in the horse race with the rising hegemon, they need the allies. That has not been the case in the past, but today it is. But they don't realize that in how they deal with the allies. I want to be in one camp with the US, but I do not want to be in a boot camp run by Sheriff Arpaio from Arizona, if you know what I mean. So what we would need has been expressed more than 20 years ago by President Bush Sr. He spoke at the time of partnership in leadership. I would add partnership in leadership and responsibility, but that's the new rule of the game. And in order to convince America that has acquired the habit of believing that dealing with allies adequately means welcoming them and telling them, line up back there, we need to cooperate with like-minded partners like Japan to convince America to go for this strategy of partnership in leadership.
Yeah, so we got to up the offer. Okay, so Dr. Beyrer, Klaus gets a point. I'm sorry, gentlemen, you're not women. So, ladies, we'll go here next.
So first, again, to say I fully agree. And the same for how we, on the IRA. Last year, more or less at the same time, a bit earlier. I've been almost, for the first time in my life, I've been almost thrown out of a meeting in the USDR for addressing the IRA. People say, what the fuck are you talking about? Luckily, over the weeks that followed, we were able to explain to our American friends that the perfect storm was preparing. I had a meeting of all my adherents in Europe, and we at least got into procedure. How far will we go? We talk about 232 billion discriminatory money. We are negotiating the electric vehicles. This is 8 billion. We probably will go to Washington next week. We'll probably get something on the critical raw materials, which is one of 3 things we wanted out of the 8 billion. So very modest. But this is not so much the issue. I think what we heard then is, well, the Europeans are whiners. You should have done your homework. On this, I agree. Up to a certain extent, it was a wake-up call for us. So, yeah. But the second part is, no, you think we have targeted you, but the truth is we didn't even think about you. And I said, well, there's the problem. Because, if you don't think about your main ally, then we have an issue of communication. Same when we talk about how do we deal with China. I'm deeply convinced that we'll only be able to manage this together and also with other like-minded countries. But we have said this umpteen times. This means we need to discuss it and we need to develop joint ownership because then it will be sustainable. And there can be situations where US takes the lead and we will follow. I mean, totally clear. But it cannot be every time because then it will not work in the long run.
And at least with this administration, we've brought the EU-US TTC up. We have a working group there. We have at least a consistent dialogue there. We have next Friday on the 20th an EU-US summit, something that George W. Bush Jr. got rid of. So at least we have various formats in which to discuss, which we don't have with the Chinese. So those differences exist. Klaus, Welle, ladies, women, I need to see some hands.
Yeah, I would just like to say acting as the EU is the precondition to be a player. So we are not acting as the European Union, we don't exist. So we have to act as the European Union, but that also means that we have to use the foreign policy instruments we have. For example, we can theorize about our relationships to Latin America, but if we don't do Mercosur, we have no leg to stand on with Latin America. We pretend to have foreign policy bodies, the European External Action Service, a high representative, but all bound back to anonymity decisions. That means we don't have a foreign policy. So the question is, do we want to have a foreign policy? Yes or no? And then who is the decision maker? And that's why I said, my impression is the foreign ministers are too weak. It probably will have to settle with the heads of state and government in the European Council. And the third thing is, I'm a big fan of transatlantic. I'm a German Christian Democrat. I always say German Christian Democrats are intellectually extremely poor. We had only 3 ideas in the last 70 years, and they all come from Adenauer: European integration, transatlantic partnership, and social market economy. So it cannot be put in doubt on transatlantic, but it's no longer enough. We need to go to trilateral schemes. We need to systematically create bodies which involve Japan, which involve South Korea, and which we also need to invest much, much more into India.
Okay, good, I have one. All the way in the back, and because we're running out of time, we're gonna take these 3 questions together. Did you still have your question? Okay, so we're gonna do a speed round of questions back to front, middle to last row in the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Harula Meliou. I'm head of policy at ESWET, European Suppliers of Waste Energy Technology, but mostly interested in the whole discussion. So I was again yesterday in another event, and the topic was sideways the European elections, and also how do we create strategic advantages for Europe. So the strategic kind of stands out. It's the key, I guess. And in the whole discussion, we put emphasis on investing in renewables, which can also create jobs. And we are behind from China in the investments in renewable technology. We are ahead of the US, but certainly there is a great space there to do a lot. With regards to job creation, because it was not mentioned before, I wanted to mention that I would like to hear the speaker's views about how that can create a better setup for European citizens, hence leading up to their security. Better lives, better safety, overall sustainability, resilience, etc. And I guess I need to come to a question. It would be, yes, enlargement, absolutely, and we need to do it fast. But would that hinder in any way looking at other ways in which we can create strategic advantages, like investing in renewables and going faster with decarbonization efforts to meet the targets for 2050.
So on core issues of the European Union, can it walk and chew gum at the same time? Middle row here.
My name is Johann Solgrova. I work for the European Commission in trade, and before I used to work in regional policy. I like very much what Mr. Bütikofer and Mr. Welle said, and I have one question. why is your party, and we need open markets, why is your party in the European Parliament so difficult when it comes to trade agreements? And what do you think about, you're already difficult with CETA, Canada, friendly trading partner. What do you personally think about Mercosur and EU-India? And the second point is, I liked very much what you said, Mr. Bütikofer, on China. I was approached, I was representing EU in Vienna for some years, every week by the Chinese embassy, and they told me we can adopt an infrastructure project in 2.5 months. And the EIB and the EU takes 2.5 years. And there's a systemic problem in it, and there's even an investigation now between the DGs of the Commission. But how can we change that? With project selection criteria, the Chinese do not offer their domestic public procurement market. What is your take on this?
Great, and Paulus gets the last question. Oh, do we have the microphone? Oh, coming to you from behind.
Hi, thank you for that. My name is Paulus Kuncinas, board member of United Europe, also speaking here as Lithuanian. My question is as follows. So I agree with your diagnosis that into this election, it's all about geopolitics. Geopolitics stupid. And as someone from the Baltic states on the frontier, I feel both quite threatened, more than quite threatened, but also I feel a deep sense of strategic ambiguity. Let's call it a vacuum, a leadership vacuum. And my big fear is, what I'm noticing is the absence of ambition going into this election. Nobody is talking about federal Europe. Nobody is talking about more Europe in a meaningful sense. Nobody is proposing united European army. I hear nobody's talking about Eurobonds, issuing, a common bond for Europe to fund ourselves. In fact, what I'm witnessing in Slovakia and Poland and Germany and France is retreating to the lowest common denominator, which is national interest. And the dilemma, I guess, for all of us here is that, unfortunately, more Europe addressing this geopolitical stress challenge head-on is an unwinnable electional formula, because we would have to, unfortunately, to educate our populations, which is not, we don't have time for. So my question is, how do we get there? How do we sell more Europe to European populations?
Well, we've come full circle. We started with, can we educate voters? Can we educate voters? Can we not? I am going to take the liberty of the chair and go in this direction, because so many of the last points were directed at Reinhard, and then we'll finish off. Dr. Beyrer.
There's quite a potpourri, but
yes, I can remind you of the potpourri too, if that helps, but yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, first on, I totally agree. We need to have bold strategic goals. Yeah, but let me take. It's all a question of political will as well. Mercosur has been stressed several times. We have this agreement on the table. It is economically very interesting. If we talk about geopolitics, if we are not able to take the hugest market which is available at the time being and ready at the table. And it also makes sense, as I see it, from an environmental point of view, because this is the only instrument we have to improve situation there. If we don't conclude the agreement, well, they will say, okay, what do these post-colonial Europeans want? Why do they even tell us what we should do? So for me, it's very much about just having a frank look at things and say, okay, what is our goal? We want to be geostrategic, geoeconomic, whatever. If we are not able to see such an opportunity, it will be very difficult to deliver upon. Renewables, well, I don't know whether this was a question, but fully agree. Of course, the goal must be that we of course, go in this direction, but of course, there's also a cost component. I mean, I often hear that as of 2026, prices will go down. 2030, we will have enough renewable, meaning we will have competitive prices and be more independent. Wonderful. I fully support this. I'm just saying we need to have the industries by then who will be able to first I mean, to deliver and also use this energy by then. And yeah, and on enlargement, I mean, we are about to discuss. I mean, we have already done this. I mean, I have members from most of these countries which are in discussion, candidate countries anyhow. We have them all in our ranks. We've just been to Turkey, for instance, not the most prominent candidate country at the time being, but still, I mean, I think we have an opening for the customs union. So we're working on all this, but I also think there's a couple of rules we will need to change. I mean, if we just take in everybody and do not make our rules more efficient, and we have been at this point many times, I mean, then it will be difficult. So we will need to do these things in parallel.
Cathryn has already mapped out components of the governance crisis. But just to remind, we had the piece on the Green Party on the trade agreements, which Reinhard will lean into. You had the potential contradiction in case, and then we had, why are we not more ambitious? Because we are so afraid of our voters, or what's going on?
Yeah, that's the question. So it was suggested that we have to educate voters or populations. When you ask voters and populations for more than 30 years, their top priority is integrating in foreign affairs, security and defense. And that's exactly what we haven't been doing. I know opinion polling in Germany where this is top since the early 90s. So why isn't it happening? Because what now needs to be done, both when we are speaking about border protection, but also security and defense, is about the core of what national administrations perceive as national sovereignty. And they are not going to give it. So have a look at the Nice Intergovernmental Conference. The outcome was 0. Why? Because you asked national civil servants, what did they still want to move to Europe? The answer was nothing, nothing. Therefore, we needed a change of method. We went to the convention model, which was dominated by members of national parliament and European Parliament, and they had lots of idea what could be additionally done. So the key thing is to give a key role to the representatives of the people, which are members of European Parliament and members of national parliament. When you would ask me about my level of ambition, I'm always arguing for the F word. No, F like federal. No, federal. I would even argue we have a federal structure. It's not even an ambition. We are federal. And I'm currently working on a project where the starting point was European Army, but my conviction is we have to start from the base and not from the top. We have to create the objective preconditions to one day be able to go there and not start, let's say, with the let's say, European Army. Maybe a word on strategy. I managed the administration of the European Parliament with a scheme which was called Strategic Execution Framework. You start with a very abstract, changing outside conditions, then you go to identity, purpose, and so on. But what I want to say is, don't do any strategy without programs and projects for implementation. Forget about, when you see a strategy without programs and projects for implementation and implementation control, let's better not have that strategy. So you have to go through it and you have to go to the implementation level. Then you have a strategy. And the last word, did we lack leadership? If I take Ukraine, absolutely. No leadership from Germany, no leadership from France. But I was asked in a bilateral meeting by Henry Kissinger last October, I said, who is the leader of Europe? And I said, on Ukraine, I have to say Ursula von der Leyen. Of course, to provoke him also a little bit.
Okay, we have a two-finger, and then Reinhard gets all the last words, and then we will wrap.
So one sentence on Ukraine, because I wanted to say it before, and now this is the right moment. I mean, this is actually something we need to learn from the Americans, because if I talk to my companies, Of course, I mean, we always have these attempts that people should invest in Ukraine. I mean, there's a couple of things we need to solve, security issues, insurance, and so on and so on. But there's a very clear distinction between us and our American friends. We have 27 programs, or maybe 22 or whatever, but there's a Belgian one, a German one, a French one. They all go with their delegations and so on and so on. And nobody understands anything at the end. For the US, I mean, there's always very clear, there's Petty Pritzker now, there has been state secretaries before. There's always clear who is the telephone number, how much money is available, who do we need to call, and where do you go. And this is something we need to improve. Because otherwise it's a bit what Hannes said. I mean, you have the ERB coming, the EBRD, the European Commission, the ECB, whatever, and there's no telephone number. And this is something we need to improve, because otherwise, I mean, we will not be in the center of the Ukrainian reconstruction, even so we will pay most of it.
Let me just make a personal recommendation, because Colin Kahl, the Undersecretary of Policy in the Pentagon, was just in Berlin on Monday, and he basically gave you a recipe of what Klaus Welle laid out, which is how he wrote the national defense strategy and how it needs to, and how you get to the dollars and cents part of that, because that's the massive failure, of course, in, for instance, the German national security strategy or even the global compact, is that we don't get to the implementation part and we don't get to the point where we know what it'll cost, so we can say to our voters, here's how the trade-offs are going to work. So you can watch that American Academy Colin Kahl Monday in your own spare time. Reinhard gets the last word.
I have three very nice questions, one about leadership. I would say that on many strategic issues, including Ukraine, including China, including Indo-Pacific strategy and many others, there is a great deal of commonality between the Commission under the leadership of Mrs. von der Leyen and the European Parliament. The one actor that is not always helpful is the Council. I would say if we could find 4 or maybe 5 countries in the Council that would come together with the ambition of moving the ball and play ball together with the Commission and together with the Parliament, you would have a very proactive European Union. It doesn't need everybody to move forward, but it needs support in all the 3 institutions. And at the moment, we have not a single member state that is really showing ambition. And I include my own government in this criticism. But we also have to move beyond some of our old silos. We still think about European leadership in the terms of an Anglo-German axis. That is yesteryear's message. We need to include a voice from the eastern part of the European Union. And we have all invested far too little in the erstwhile Weimar Triangle approach that was such an effort. I think we need Poland. And we need to acknowledge that we need Poland and not just criticize them wherever they're wrong. Second question on trade. Mercosur is dead as a doornail. And not because of the European Parliament, but because of the farming lobbies in France, Belgium, and Austria. Full stop. In addition to that, the agreement has suffered a second death because the Mercosur countries have discovered that they can pose counter demands on us. Well, you may be right, but I'm describing the situation where we are. They now want to be recompensated for CBAM, recompensated for deforestation and everything. So I think that's dead, unfortunately. As regards some of the other issues, we still have a choice. India, we still have a choice. We are operating under a mandate from 2006 that asks for a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. That will not happen in the next 1,000 years. So either we are willing to compromise with India and avoid what they call regulatory or climate imperialism, and I think there would be ways of doing that. They have an active interest, but so far I hear too many voices, including from industry, that want to have it all. And I think this could be one of the cases where we allow the better to become the enemy of the good. And we should not do that. And when you ask why my party is so difficult, well, I would first concede that this is the case. I think it is the case for a very good reason. Free trade is not enough of an answer. Free and fair trade is the answer. And that has been underestimated in much of our trade policy in the past. And then we developed a certain habit of always finding 3 reasons why this particular trade agreement could not be accepted. If you look very carefully, we're changing that approach. We have voted in favor of New Zealand, we will vote in favor of Chile, and we are playing an active role in promoting India. And take another example, Indonesia. We have 3 conflicts already with them, over palm oil, over deforestation, over CBAM. Now we have this issue with nickel, where we want to push them with the enforcement regulation. And then we want to have a free trade agreement on top of that. That's not working. And we were one of the groups in the Inter committee that advocated that we should choose a different approach in order to find a solution with Indonesia. The last question about...
That will have to be for the glass of wine portion of this evening.
About ambition. Sorry to be harsh, but we should make a distinction between ambitions and pipe dreams. And some of what I have heard about federalism amounts to a pipe dream. When I, for instance, look at what the Constitutional Committee under the leadership of Guy Verhofstadt is putting on the table, I think that is full of pipe dreams. For instance, they want to have qualified majority voting on foreign policy issues, including on issues of war and peace. Sorry, that's ridiculous. That's never going to happen. The better approach is the one that was proposed by 12 experts, including your colleague Daniela Schwarzer from the French and the German academic communities, that proposed that QMV should be introduced step by step on some issues where it doesn't antagonize countries that want to insist on deciding themselves whether they're going to be in war or not. And I think some of the other issues are similar. I agree fully with what Welle said about the European army. That would be, to pursue that today would be putting the cart before the horse. We still have 168 weapons systems where the Americans have 30. Before we overcome that idiocy, calling for a European army and calling for better spending makes absolutely no sense. And I think some of the other issues are similar, but we do have ambition, and we have shown that the Union is able to show ambition. When we had to come up with a mutual debt to finance the fallout, the economic fallout from the pandemic, we were able to do that. And I think we were also able to bail out Lithuania when the Chinese tried to suffocate you economically. So I think ambition is correct, but some ambition is pursuing pipe dreams when practical solutions are available, and we should not fall into that trap.
I think all of you who have stuck it out with us for almost 2 hours will agree that we have had a very vivid discussion, one that we've exhausted Reinhard's voice. So I think that just goes to show that we have leaned into the very difficult issues on the table. I think without summarizing this very rich conversation, I think the whole component about achieving credibility that's based on an agenda that is both that features the trade-offs we need, that is clear about the expenses and the changes, also the losses, but also the opportunities that those changes can afford, and getting ahead of, to your point, the news cycle so that we are in an agency position is the very high ambition we all have to set ourselves for the next 8 months. As the Washington Post subtitles, "Democracy dies in darkness." And so I am very pleased that United Europe and other organizations that I am a part of continue to have these kind of discussions. I'm particularly pleased about all the young people in the room. That's the way that we move democracy forward, in conversation, in argument, and in care for what we need to achieve together. So thank you to my excellent panelists. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for all of those watching at home. We hope to see you again very soon at a United Europe event. Thanks very much.